The only way man can continue to prosper is to continue to be curious. And we have plenty of curiosity. This is the Be a Great Thinker podcast, examining the world and cutting through the BS, breaking down issues, looking at them through philosophical and intellectual eyes. And now your host, author of the book with the same title, the Be a Great Thinker podcast. This is Adrian Roth.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Be a Great Thinker podcast. I am your host, Adrian Roth. In today's episode, we are going to talk about a subject that I thought I would never have to speak about. It is a subject that, though I know we had not necessarily resolved, was at least one that as a society, I thought, was something that we had started to become more enlightened over. But, unfortunately, over the last few years, it has become more dominant in our culture. And that is cruelty and hate. I have confessed in a previous podcast episode that I am in my 50s. That being said, I grew up during the 70s and 80s. There were many things that were different about how people acted back then as opposed to what they do today. The world was a little bit different while I was a child, and not necessarily for the better in many aspects. Back in the 70s, making an off-color or racist joke was not frowned upon. People used racial slurs as part of their daily conversation without much thought. It was nothing to denigrate not only people of different races and cultures, but women, disabled persons, overweight people, people with high IQs and odd eccentricities, the homeless, people who were poor and uneducated, and anyone with a physical deformity. It seemed that no one, who was in any way different, was off base when it came to jokes and derogatory comments. Misogyny was also something that wasn't a big deal. Women were not respected. They could not climb the ladder of success, and if they tried, they were either shot down, harassed, or made to feel less than their male counterparts. Smacking a woman on the ass or making her feel sexualized and uncomfortable was just what the average guy did. If a woman complained, then she was a bitch, and it was clear that there was something wrong with her. It kind of felt that a woman should appreciate being sexualized, because the way some men acted, they felt that women, in general, were hardly good for anything else. During those days, a woman needed to know her place and not rock the boat. When I was a kid, my mother became an early feminist. She put a bumper sticker on her car that said, "Women belong in the House and in the Senate." And this expression of feminine power was a big deal in the 1970s. When the first publication of Gloria Steinem's Ms. magazine came out, Mom bought it and renewed her subscription to the magazine every year until she passed away. I think we still have that first magazine in storage somewhere. She was on the front lines of the movement to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. The ERA wanted to pass a constitutional amendment that gave women the same rights as men in this country. This was in all facets of society, from the workplace to just being able to live in the country without feeling like a second-class citizen. But they could not get enough states to ratify the amendment, and it was a great disappointment when the ERA movement failed in their attempt. She instilled in my sister and me to believe that women were just as capable, talented, and free as any man. My father also did his best to make his two daughters understand that we were important and that no man should ever make us feel different or less. He would claim that he was also a feminist, mainly because he supported my mother when she decided to go back to school to get her college degree. But, like all the men of that time, my father continuously needed his ego stroked in order to keep up that support. My mother made sure to do that. As enlightened as he was, it had its limits. I was born in the mid-1960s. In the mid-1960s, women married young, had lots of babies, and were happy to be homemakers and not career women. The few careers there were for women at that time amounted to low-paying jobs with little recognition or the ability to move ahead. Also, if a woman did not get married but rather chose to stay single, she was considered an old maid and an aberration. Women did not have the right to own property. They could not get a credit card without a husband's signature or approval. They could not get a loan or start a business on their own. They always needed the support of a man to do that. They could not serve on a jury. They weren't accepted in Ivy League schools like Yale, Princeton, or Harvard. There was definitely no equality in the workplace either. But worst of all, women did not have autonomy over their bodies. Only married women were allowed the birth control pill when it first came out. If a woman did get pregnant, abortion was illegal, and so the only way to get this done was to try and abort the baby herself or get a dangerous, back-alley abortion. Those methods often killed the women along with the fetus. Yet, as I grew up, things did improve, mainly because women were tired of being second-class citizens. The ERA might not have passed in Congress, but it had a real impact on society, and it helped women break free of the chains they were subjected to. Over the next half-century, women made real strides in every facet of society. But even as women achieved the freedoms and successes and equality that had eluded them for too long, there were others that resented this. Most of them were men, but some were women who never agreed with the shift in the balance of the world. Those who resisted these empirical changes generally were caught up in very strict religious movements. It wasn't just Christian evangelicals, though they had the loudest voices and the most pull and influence. It was also other deeply orthodox sects of all religions. Not one of them thought women should have as much say or power as they now seem to have. These groups wanted to return to the good old days when women could only speak when spoken to and do as their husbands told them to do. These religious groups found a way to infiltrate the government and, in turn, the judiciary to bring what they felt was a disordered world back into order, as they saw it. They used the pro-life movement to bring this about. But years ago, when abortion was legalized, most of these religious groups did not have an opinion on it. But they glommed onto it with the rise of the so-called moral majority and Christian fundamentalism, which preached that the family was all. Or in other words, women once again needed to know their place. Basically, women were baby makers and nothing else. They professed that they were only thinking of the unborn children when the truth was, they could give two shits about those kids. Because as soon as they were born, they were nothing but a burden to society. But they wanted it both ways. They wanted to prevent the abortion, and they wanted to stigmatize that child and the parent for that child's birth. With the recent Dobbs decision banning abortion, they have gained the one success they sought over the last 4 to 5 decades. And now, because of this horrific decision by the Supreme Court, women have taken such a drastic turn, seemingly going back to those days when the dynamics of society put women in a very terrible place. It was like going back to my childhood, but only really the worst parts of that time. But that wasn't the only place where women experienced the onslaught of cruelty. It seemed that for a time, misogyny also had been tamped down, especially in the workplace. But the Me Too movement showed us that it had never quite disappeared. And for a couple of years, the men who blatantly demeaned and harassed women were getting called out and finally getting justice for their bad behavior. But even this movement eventually backfired. With so many men being exposed, it got to be too much. People started to get wary of the continuous barrage of women coming forward with accusations of powerful men. People started to question the women coming forward, claiming that they were lying or just trying to ride the wave of the Me Too movement. These men, and the social media network that supported them, started to say they were being cancelled. When Christine Blasey Ford accused Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh of sexual harassment, those in power did not take her accusation seriously. The FBI refused to check her or other sources that made the same claims. They let it slide, and Kavanaugh was allowed to become a Supreme Court justice for the rest of his life, and he was allowed to help rule on laws that would take away women's rights, which he ultimately did with the overturning of Roe v. Wade. There was much legitimacy to the claims that Blasey Ford and other women made, but once again, their opinions did not matter. Women were once again subjected to being second-class citizens. Women weren't the only ones to experience the wrath of society. Those in the LGBTQ community have always experienced this. There are so many dynamics in the LGBTQ community. And if you were a part of it, in any form or fashion, you had to stay silent. Otherwise, you wouldn't only be shunned, but you could also be harmed physically for just being your true self. Those who are straight may not understand how someone who feels different sexually or experiences a difference in their sense of identity might feel deep down inside. Many, if not most, grow up feeling very awkward and an outcast. The majority in the LGBTQ community start out in life not knowing anyone like them, and when they find a kindred spirit, it's like the world opens up for them. But many are alone, struggling, and in fear of being discovered because they know it could have detrimental repercussions. To always be told that something is wrong with you for whom you are attracted to, whom you love, or how you feel inside is very devastating. No one should be made to feel less than others for not being part of the norm. But what really is the norm? That is the question we should all be grappling with. In Greek society, it was very acceptable to have sex with someone of the same sex. This was not taboo at all. In fact, heterosexual sex was generally used to procreate and nothing else. Love is sexless and genderless, but realizing that and accepting it in our society has taken a long time. The LGBTQ community had only just started to make strides when the same people, those who wanted to silence and strap down women, also worked hard to eradicate the LGBTQ community. This was especially true with transsexual children and teens. They are the new boogeyman for the self-righteous bigots that need a new dragon to slay in their conquest of the world. It is hard enough for these kids to understand the world and what is happening inside their own heads and bodies, much less to be made an example of by blowhard politicians, religious zealots, prejudiced jerks, and other people with too much power and very little empathy. They want to subject these poor kids to humiliating and sometimes torturous inspections of their bodies to keep them from participating in sports or other activities that all kids should be able to participate in without question. This type of cruelty is not new. When AIDS was prevalent, anyone who got it was stained with a mark of disgust and distrust, as though their simple existence was to be feared and challenged. Ryan White was a great example of this kind of cruelty. He got AIDS from a blood transfusion, and he was immediately shunned, kept from living a normal life, and made to be a pariah by ignorant people who didn't care to hear the truth, but only relied on their biases and miseducation that guided how they reacted to this very brave young man. He shouldn't have had to be brave. He should have just been able to live what was left of his life without the drama that was thrown his way. Just getting AIDS was a terrible event and meant a death sentence at that time. But to be given nothing but cruelty from prejudiced individuals only made his hard lot even worse. This is again happening to transsexual kids who only want to live their lives in peace, but will not be given that chance because the cruelty and the hatred are the point. We are going to take a very short break. When we return, we will continue this discussion on cruelty and hatred in the media and in our politics.
Tired of the bull? The gaslighting? Stupid conspiracy theories? The dumbing down of the rhetoric in our society? Do you feel you are not being heard, while at the same time you are being drowned out by loud, obnoxious, uninformed, fearmongering voices? Then it's time to join our new movement and stop the insanity. Become a member of the critical thinking revolution. Tell everyone how smart, how enlightened, and how informed you really are. Show off your membership into this new revolution by purchasing Critical Thinking Revolution merch. The merch is found on our website, beagreatthinker.com. Our merch can also be purchased at our Great Thinker stores on both Etsy and on eBay. So be proud, stay strong, and be a great thinker. And together we will become a real force, being part of the critical thinking revolution.
You're listening to the Be a Great Thinker podcast. We're bringing back the art of critical thinking.
Welcome back to the Be a Great Thinker podcast. So, where are the worst offenders when it comes to the banter of cruelty and hatred? We see far too many hate mongers spewing their vile garbage ideology on their podcasts and through social media. This is also the case on so-called news programs like those on Fox News, OAN, and Newsmax. They each seem to challenge the others to see who could be crueler and more despicable than the next vile pundit. And they never see the irony of how their sentiments play, that what they say can actually be thrown back at them. I won't play any of their words on my podcast. I don't want to give them free space or waste time on it. They don't deserve it. But when people like Tucker Carlson, Sean Hannity, Glenn Beck, Ben Shapiro, Candace Owens, Dennis Prager, and Charlie Kirk spew their vile rhetoric on their highly rated shows, they don't care how it hurts others. Only just that they get to crush those they consider the enemy into dust. This was very much the case with Alex Jones, who purposely pounded the parents of the Sandy Hook Elementary tragedy. He bombarded his audience with horrible lies that his devoted minions ate up and that they used against the poor parents of these slain children. This forced these families to endure even more heartache from all of Jones's lies. Thankfully, justice is coming their way, and Jones will have to pay over $1 billion to the parents. If justice really prevails, then maybe he will go completely broke, end up homeless, without his empire, ranting at the wall, where anyone who hears him will think that he is nothing but the truly gross creep that he actually is. It isn't just the cruelty but the hypocrisy of right-wingers that is interminable. They say they love the fetus, but they won't do anything to give the child a better life. For right-wing Republican lawmakers, any form of help to any person in need, as long as that person isn't a millionaire or billionaire, amounts to socialism, which is completely unacceptable. The mother has no right to abort that child and is forced to bring the child into the world. What awaits the child is a struggle to traverse the life it now exists in. These so-called right-to-lifers will offer no help or assistance of any sort. Once the fetus is born, they are nothing but a burden and a scourge on society. If they are the wrong color, the wrong sex, or like their own sex instead of the opposite one, or if they come from the wrong religion, have the wrong culture, speak the wrong language, or are in any way not subservient, then they should be eradicated, but only after they were forced to be born. Only after. The same people who want to control a woman's body also want to ensure that a child can marry a man much older than her. They are fine with child marriages because that is part of some very religious doctrine. Very selfish, abhorrent white supremacist religious nuts have no issue with this and do not see how hypocritical this stance is. They never will. This is just another step in controlling women. It is why The Handmaid's Tale is becoming a reality and not just a place in dark fiction. Then there is the issue of guns. We won't go into the subject of the proliferation of guns in American society or whether we should ban them or not. I will save that for another podcast. What I want to touch upon is the cruelty behind the gun rights movement. I have a motto. It's kind of hardcore. The motto is, this is what the right wing believes, give every fetus a gun. As twisted as that motto might seem, there is much truth behind it. Simply put, right-wingers love guns and they love fetuses more than they love children. My belief in this becomes stronger with each school shooting. Each one gets a little worse. Instead of condemning the shooters and the proliferation of assault weapons and feeling no empathy for grieving families, these horrible right-wingers will only protect their right to possess and use that weapon. To them, the weapon is all sacred. Life, unless it is a fetus, is meaningless. It appears, to their twisted ideology, guns are so much more important than the life of a child. It really does not matter if a child dies from gun violence or that a parent grieves that child. That is, in their opinion, simply collateral damage. The gun rules all, and your kid doesn't matter. It is especially so if the child is from a liberal-leaning family. Hey, when that is the case, then it means that one more lib is owned. The Republican right-wing cruelty comes from another, very offensive ideology. All that seems to matter is that they must own the libs at all costs. Owning the libs was a phrase that started in the world of video games. It began in the 1990s and was used by computer hackers. Owning someone, especially someone you were competing against, did not necessarily mean that you were beating them, at least in the literal term. No, it meant that you were doing an act that would frustrate, infuriate, and distress your opponent. This idea really took hold in the early 2000s, when younger right-wing pundits like Ben Shapiro and others would go on college campuses and play on the emotions of their cohorts. They combined politics and entertainment, which was picked up by other right-wing blowhards like Rush Limbaugh, Glenn Beck, and Alex Jones. The idea was to own the educated elites, to evoke an unhinged emotional response so that they could prove that liberals and progressives, who did react to their trolling behavior, were weak and biased. In contrast, the ones doing the trolling, such as these right-wing fools, believed themselves to be above the liberal elites. They believed they were victorious when they managed to get left-wingers pissed off from their stupid and cruel antics. It, unfortunately, worked. Not because the right-wing trolls were saying things that made sense, but because they were acting like an evil older sibling who was incessantly teasing their younger sibling and making that younger sibling cry or scream out in frustration as they tried desperately to get the evil sibling to stop their bullying. But the more the trolls got the reaction they sought, the more they enjoyed doing it, and the worse their trolling behavior became. This is very typical bullying behavior. When they saw how Democrats and liberals would react, they pounced, and the cruelty increased. Soon politicians got on board, but no one more so than Trump. He became the king and master, and a god to the trolls, because he could out-troll everyone. I mean, he did such a good job, he became president, and he ruled like the vile troll he was. Because he now had power, others followed him with a vengeance. Trump and his cronies got to make the rules. They got to appoint the people who would follow their ideology. They never really wanted to govern. That was too much work. They wanted to continue playing their cruel, horrible games because that was where their payoff was. The cruelty was all that mattered. The phrase, "the cruelty is the point," came from a 2018 article written by Adam Serwer in The Atlantic. It was all about how Trump and his supporters delighted in bringing about suffering to those they consider their enemies. But it wasn't just about abject cruelty or being like a cartoon villain, the kind you see that has a long mustache and who snickers as he rubs his hands in delight while his victim squirms under his deviousness. No, it was worse than that. These were the kind of villains who would thrust their cruelty onto others and then gaslight everyone, accusing the liberals and the liberal media as being equally, if not more so, the ones who were devious and corrupt. They were really good at the gaslighting. In fact, the liberal media kept falling into their lair. So, it was easy to accept the cruelty and believe the lies. And those who followed Trump and his band of trolls began to see them not as the villains that they actually were, and still are, but that they were the real heroes. The cruelty and the hatred was now becoming the norm. The problem is that the media falls for this all the time. They keep believing that both sides are the same when they are far from it. But they contend they must be fair when reporting the news. They must see each side, as though each side has a valid point, when they clearly don't. They refuse to make a distinction between the right-wing trolls and anyone who is thinking normally and clearly. It feels as if the media doesn't understand that these right-wingers want nothing but to disrupt, destroy, and bring down anything of value that makes this country what it can and still should be. These right-wingers hate anyone who does not feel how they feel. And they will do what they must to make their enemies bow to their will. Especially if it means subjecting these enemies to cruel and horrible behaviors. They are not above it. But the media doesn't seem to understand that, or refuses to approach it, so the cruelty continues to intensify because few people of any influence are doing anything to stop it. Liberals, Democrats, progressives, and moderate Republicans, if there is actually any of those left, don't have the compunction to hurt others. They are not perfect by any stretch of the imagination and have many flaws, but as bad as they sometimes are, they pale in comparison to the trolls that have taken over the right-wing media and right-wing politics. That takes us to the next point. It isn't just the cruelty. It is also the hatred. If you have listened to my previous podcasts, you already know a few things about me. One of the things that I spoke about is that my family is Jewish and that we had family members that died or suffered deeply under the hands of the Nazis. I grew up very aware of my heritage and how the terrible tragedy of the genocide of the Jews affected how my parents related to the world. My father often expressed his disdain for Germans and Polish people because of what he experienced growing up. I never agreed with his bigoted sentiments, but I understood where they came from. As I stated earlier, using bigoted and racist rhetoric was not completely frowned upon as I grew up. But I personally always found it distasteful. I remember friends of mine freely using the N-word without thought, but I would often recoil from it. I remember a few times telling them to stop using that word, as I simply did not like racist speech being used around me. A friend of mine once used the term "Jew them down" when she was explaining how she got someone to lower the cost of something. I immediately told her that this was not an acceptable term to use. She was stunned by my objection, since she had used that term throughout her life and saw nothing wrong with it. I then explained to her that this was an anti-Semitic trope created when people considered Jews to be cheap and hoarding all the money. This started in the medieval era because, at that time, Jews were only allowed to be money lenders, and they were hated for it. So, anyone who used that trope now was just reflecting on how they could get away with supposedly cheating a cheater. I know she had not been educated to understand how hurtful her statement was. She was half Polish, half Hispanic, and her son was half black. I am sure she might have experienced her own taste of racism from time to time. She should have been more aware of her words and how hurtful they could be, but as I have explained in other episodes, you can be a bigot and a racist regardless of your skin color, background, or religion. The one trait we all share is being human. We are raised with biases and are taught how to act in society by our parents, our relatives, our friends, and those we have close ties to. And if someone doesn't help you to understand how to think differently, more humanely, then you will continue to say and do things that are harmful. After I explained the origin of that awful, anti-Semitic statement, I never heard her say it again. She was mindful to watch her words. Maybe it was only around me, but still, it gave her pause. Hopefully, she never used it again with anyone. I know many people believed that when Obama became president, that we crossed a real threshold in our society. Many of us thought that maybe this country was going to become more enlightened. But there was always an undercurrent of hate, and it became the catalyst for the alt-right, the Tea Party, and other white supremacist movements that started to proliferate during the Obama administration. Racism had hardly been extinguished in the country just because we elected a black president. Those new, racist movements were proof of that. My hope was that after we elected the first African American president, that we would then elect a woman. I really felt that Hillary Clinton had the best shot. Her being president would show that all of the hard work that my mother put into getting equal rights for women would finally come to fruition, to some degree. But to my very grave disappointment, it appeared that this country preferred to elect an inept, misogynistic, racist buffoon over one of the best qualified people to ever run for the office of president. With Trump's election, the country was quickly starting to be ripped at its seams. Because Trump hated women and was racist and cruel to his core, it was now okay to hate women, black people, Latinos, Asian people, immigrants, the LGBTQ community, Muslims, and Jews. Right-wing trolls, politicians, pundits, and celebrities equated the Black Lives Matter movement to the insurrection of January 6, saying they were the same. They would claim that they appreciated the cops and would defend them, without fail, when a cop shot an innocent black or Latino person in the back, for no apparent reason at all. But then, they would turn on the cops, especially those law officers that tried to defend democracy from the mob of Trump minions who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. In their minds, it's okay to kill innocent black people. There is nothing wrong with that. The more, the merrier. Just don't touch any white supremacists, or they will seek revenge for the wrongs committed against them. Killing is not necessarily out of the question. It just depends who is doing the killing and who is being killed. These white supremacists and trolls play both sides, and they never see or understand the hypocrisy of their beliefs. After surviving tragedy during World War II and then coming to America to make a better life for themselves, my parents would never have expected to see the same kind of cruelty and hatred they had experienced in Hungary as children. It is now more prevalent here. I am glad that neither of my parents had lived to see the horrible change in the political and social atmosphere that now grips our country like it had in 1930s Europe when they were growing up. Anti-Semitism is getting deeper and stronger by the day. To hate the Jews is the breeding ground to hating other groups. Once it becomes mainstream again to hate Jews, then no other group, is safe. Just look at the recent tweets from Kanye West. If he can tweet that he wants to kill Jews and gets no backlash from the right wing, then the line of hatred that is crossed can never be uncrossed. In fact, instead of any backlash, Trump took it to another level by basically threatening Jews with his own social media post. It only added more fuel to the fire and increased the inevitability of violence against Jews. Also, when a beloved college football coach turned senator spews vile racist tropes against African Americans in a state he represents that has a very large number of black residents, he should automatically be reprimanded for saying such terrible, hateful rhetoric. But this hardly caused any Republicans to blink an eye, and some actually cheered him on. What all of this means is that we are quickly reaching a boiling point. The fact is, the right wing loves this. They love seeing liberals, Democrats, and anyone with any sense in their brain or soul wriggle under the pure vileness of their horrific words and actions. They like to see liberals being offended. It feeds their insatiable hunger for hate and cruelty. They keep trying to outdo each other, and they keep succeeding. There is no bottom with them, and there probably never will be at this point. If we try to ignore them, it only makes them louder. If we try to confront them, they throw back that we are the same as they are. They play this awful game, and they will never lose that game. The only way they can lose that game is if they are weeded out. As long as they have a voice, and as long as they have power, they will dominate, and the rest of us will suffer. Again, cruelty is the point, and the only thing that matters to them. How do we fight this? First, by not being apathetic and by not falling into their impossible traps. We can't let them keep winning. We must eradicate them, not by violence, but by being louder, stronger, and more determined. We have to make sure that none of these horrible right-wingers stay in power and keep spewing their terrible lies and cruel rhetoric. We still have the power to stop them, but you can only do so with your vote and your voice. If you do not use either, then they will win, and the cruelty will get even worse. None of us want that. We don't want to find ourselves in a world so dark, cruel, and horrific that we can't come back from it. We can't let that happen. Another way to help is to join me in my movement, the Critical Thinking Revolution movement. Together, we can show everyone that we all stand for sanity, hope, and intelligence. If you want to be part of this movement, then you can purchase a shirt, a bag, a mug, or other merchandise at my website, beagreatthinker.com, or at my Etsy store, Great Thinker. Please help me spread the word, and let's get this revolution off the ground. Let us show these nasty right-wing trolls that they aren't the only ones with the voice and the power. That is all I have for today's episode. Please don't forget to subscribe to this podcast to hear more episodes, and please share the episode with your friends and family. Please also give us a good review if you liked this episode. We will be back soon with the next episode of the Be a Great Thinker podcast. Until then, please remember to question everything.
You've been listening to the Be a Great Thinker podcast. We take deep dives and look at stories from social, the psychological, the political, the ridiculous, to the mundane. It's what we do. Celebrating ideological diversity and independent thinking. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review. But in the meantime, hit the website at beagreatthinker.com, on Facebook at Be a Great Thinker, and on Etsy at Great Thinker. See you next time.